What if I told you that there is an ancient manuscript that claims that Jesus had children and that the church did everything to hide it? It may seem shocking, and it is, because this information, if true, not only completely changes what you believe about the life of Jesus, it also exposes one of the greatest spiritual conspiracies in human history. For centuries, the Vatican was the most powerful institution on the planet, not only controlling faith, but also knowledge. And among the archives that were never made public, there are documents, gospels, and manuscripts that directly contradict everything that was taught in the pulpits, in religious schools, and in catechisms. One of these documents, known by few scholars and completely ignored by the church, describes in detail that Jesus was not a solitary man, but someone who had a companion, a sacred union with Mary Magdalene, and that children were born from this relationship. A living lineage, a direct blood heritage that has been carefully erased from official history. And the burning question is, why? Why hide it? What is behind this secret that justifies centuries of silence, persecution, and censorship? Imagine the impact of this revelation. Imagine how millions of people around the world would react to learning that the history that has been taught in churches for generations may be incomplete, or worse, intentionally altered. We are not talking about an unfounded theory. We are talking about manuscripts that were found in ancient monasteries, texts translated from Aramaic, Coptic, and ancient Greek, and which provide detailed descriptions of a reality completely different from that narrated by the canonical Gospels. Manuscripts that the Vatican never recognized, but also never explained why it hid. In this video, you will understand why this information was suppressed, who was interested in erasing this part of history, and what this document really reveals about the life of Jesus. But before we go straight to the contents of the manuscript, we need to understand the context, the origins of this forbidden text, and how it survived the centuries of darkness and silence. Because it is precisely in the shadows of history that the greatest truths remain hidden. Because it is precisely in the shadows of history that the greatest truths remain hidden. And if you're here, listening to me until now, it's because you feel that something is wrong, that there is more behind the official narrative, that this story has layers that we have never been told. When we delve into topics like this, which involve faith, spirituality, lost documents, and Vatican secrets, we are not just investigating historical facts. We are accessing a truth that directly touches our spirit, that challenges our deepest beliefs, and invites us to reflect on who we are, what we believe, and what we have been led to believe. Therefore, I want to take advantage of this moment and extend a special invitation to you. If this message touched you in any way, if it awakened doubts, emotions, or even faith, leave your prayer request here in the comments. It could be for you, for your family, for wisdom, for spiritual discernment, or simply for the courage to continue seeking the truth. No matter what it is, we will pray for you. This channel is not just about revelations. It is also about spiritual connection, support, and living faith. Because as we reveal the secrets of the Vatican and expose the forbidden Gospels, we also need to be united spiritually, supporting each other. And if you believe that more people need access to this content, leave your like right now. This helps the video reach more truth seekers like you. It is clear, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because in the next videos, we will bring even more surprising revelations, forgotten texts, buried documents, and evidence that was never shown to the public. Now tell me here in the comments, do you believe Jesus really had children? And if you feel it in your heart, also write, I want prayer for the truth. This shows that you are with us on this journey of faith, mystery, and revelation. We're just getting started. This document was found in a forgotten library in the Middle East, a place where time seemed to have stopped, where the walls still carried the dust of centuries of silence, and where the light passed through small cracks in the stones, as if destiny itself was revealing what had been hidden for so long. A manuscript wrapped in linen cloths, darkened by time, carefully sealed with ancient symbols, kept as if it were a sacred artifact, because in fact, for those who understand its contents, that is exactly what it represents, an explosive fragment of a truth that official history has refused to tell. According to scholars who had access to the document, hidden for years by a small monastic order that did not follow the Vatican, the text presented a narrative completely different from that told in the canonical Gospels. There, in Aramaic language and passages in Koine Greek, Jesus was not just the spiritual Messiah. He was also a man, master, leader, and a father. Yes, the manuscript described an intimate, deep, and sacred relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, portrayed not as a minor disciple, but as his companion, consort, and guardian of a secret that would span generations, a sacred lineage. This text, more than 1900 years old, was kept out of reach of major religious institutions, and that is why it survived. It did not pass through the hands of the first councils, was not analyzed under the political filters of Nicaea, nor was it included or excluded due to imperial interest. It simply remained forgotten, or rather protected, until it was found by independent researchers during a routine archaeological expedition. Little did they know that they were about to stumble upon one of humanity's greatest spiritual secrets. The first translations caused astonishment, and not just because of the content, but because of the tone. The text spoke calmly, with authority, as if it were a letter written by someone who lived alongside the Master and knew his intimate history. In one passage, Mary Magdalene is called she who fully understood the heart of the Master, and in another, it speaks of children begotten under the blessing of eternal light, a term rarely used outside first-century mystical circles. Further on, the text describes a planned escape, where Jesus and Mary leave Galilee towards a distant land to protect the fruit of their union, a land that many scholars identify as southern Gaul, today the territory of France. From this narrative, the theory is born that a direct lineage of Jesus survived in secret, protected for generations, and that certain groups, such as the Templars and some Rosicrucian orders, were aware of this fact and helped protect their descendants. But why did this never come to light? Why has the Church never officially recognized, analyzed, or even commented on this manuscript? The answer seems obvious, because admitting this possibility would collapse the entire power structure built over the centuries. The figure of Jesus as a father, as a man who loved and generated life, humanizes his trajectory and undermines the idea that salvation can only come through suffering and the cross. If he had children, then there is a living lineage. And if there is a living lineage, there is a spiritual heritage that goes beyond dogma, a heritage that belongs to the people, not to institutions. The existence of this lineage would break the monopoly of faith, and perhaps that is why the Vatican, throughout history, has pursued so hard everything related to Mary Magdalene. Documents were burned, images were erased, and her figure was reduced to that of a repentant sinner, without any spiritual importance. But behind the scenes, the most daring scholars have always known that there was something much bigger behind its constant presence in the apocryphal texts. In Gospels such as that of Philip, that of Thomas, and that of Mary, she appears as the one closest to Jesus, the one who understood the mysteries that not even the other apostles understood. And now, with this manuscript in hand, everything starts to fall into place. The story reconstructs itself like a large mosaic, where each piece was hidden in a different part of the world, waiting to be discovered. And you who are watching this video now are part of this reconstruction. Because as these documents come to light, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And what was once whispered in forbidden corners is now beginning to be spoken out loud, accessible to everyone. What is at stake here is not just a theological question, but a profound transformation in the way we understand Jesus' role in history, and more importantly, our own role within this forgotten truth. That's why this channel exists, to bring to light what has been erased, to give voice to the manuscripts that slept for centuries under the dust of oblivion, and to show that there is much more to the life of Jesus than the cross can tell. If you feel like this revelation is touching something inside you, then this journey isn't just about historical curiosity. It's spiritual, because it's not just a question of whether Jesus had children. It's about discovering what the Church never wanted you to know, that the lineage of light may be alive to this day. And now that you know where this document was found, that you understand the context in which it was preserved, and the reason why it was kept secret for so long, we are left to ask the most important question of all. What exactly does this manuscript say? What are the words written there so carefully that have been kept from the world? In the next section, we will dive directly into the content of this forbidden gospel, and what you will hear now may shake everything you thought you knew about faith, about the church, and about the figure of Jesus himself. If this is already messing with you, leave the phrase, "I want to see the complete manuscript," in the comments. This shows that you are committed to this pursuit. Also comment if you want one prayer request. Write below, and we will pray together. Jesus would have lived in secret with Mary Magdalene, and children were born from this union. This is the central statement contained in the hidden manuscript, the same one that was rescued from a forgotten library in the Middle East, and which, according to scholars who analyzed its fragments, could completely change the history of Christianity as we know it. This document is not symbolic, it is not allegorical, nor is it limited to mystical interpretations. He speaks clearly, and with an almost prophetic serenity about a truth that has been stifled over the centuries. Jesus didn't just love Mary Magdalene, he built a family with her. This revelation, written in careful strokes on aged papyrus, narrates episodes from the life of Jesus that are not in any of the canonical Gospels. He appears as an enlightened master, yes, but also as a man aware of his mission to transmit not only the word, but also the inheritance of the Spirit through blood. The text suggests that his union with Mary Magdalene was a kind of spiritual and divine alliance, sealed away from the public eye, in a reserved, sacred environment, known only to a few more intimate disciples. And it is precisely this small group that would have been responsible for protecting both the Master's companion and the fruits of this union, his children. According to this document, Jesus would have taken Mary and her children to a distant land, referred to in the writings as the Land of the West, interpreted by several scholars as the south of present-day France, while his followers maintained preaching in Jerusalem and the regions of Galilee. The intention was clear: to ensure that his offspring would be protected from the coming persecution, because Jesus' enemies, the same ones who wanted his death, would not be satisfied with the cross alone. They knew that if he had a family, the lineage would become dangerous, because it would symbolize continuity, legacy, living spiritual authority, something that could escape the control of the religious leaders of the time, and later, the power structures of the church. This manuscript describes in great detail the figure of Mary Magdalene not as a silent woman who cried at the foot of the cross, but as an initiate, a guide, a bearer of wisdom. She appears to actively participate in the teachings, being consulted by Jesus in the most difficult decisions, and, in a symbolic passage, she is called the tree that bears the fruit of eternal light. This type of language, deeply rooted in Jewish mystical tradition and Gnostic symbology, shows that there was a sacred recognition of motherhood, continuity, and the passing of a spiritual mission to a future lineage. The theory of Jesus' lineage is not new, but this manuscript brings a documentary strength that few have dared to touch, not only for its content, but for the way it confirms, point by point, reports that already circulated in apocryphal texts and oral traditions, protected by secret orders, especially the Knights Templar, who would have found similar documents during their crusades in the East. According to these sources, Jesus' descendants were protected for centuries in silence, camouflaged among noble families in Europe, accompanied by encrypted manuscripts, occult symbols, and a tradition passed down from generation to generation as a sacred secret. The impact of this revelation is incalculable. It dismantles the central pillar of the narrative of an isolated, celibate, and exclusively divine Jesus. At the same time, it does not diminish him, but brings him closer. It makes him a teacher who not only preached about love and eternal life, but who lived it in its most human and true form. If he had children, then the message is transformed. No longer a single painful sacrifice to save humanity, but a conscious transmission of light through flesh, through blood, through the continuity of life. And here comes the most sensitive part. The reason why the Church has never recognized this document, nor any other that suggests the existence of a family of Jesus. Because admitting this would mean admitting that there was manipulation of the story, that choices were made out of political and institutional interest, and that the figure of Mary Magdalene was intentionally reduced to hide the role she truly played. The woman who was transformed into a symbol of sin may have actually been the guardian of the Messiah's lineage, a cruel reversal of the narrative, and at the same time, a clear clue that there was, indeed, a silencing strategy. This silence was sustained for centuries, protected by religious orders, covered by doctrines, and reinforced by images that represented Mary Magdalene only as a repentant sinner. Meanwhile, the real documents that spoke of her relationship with Jesus were being hidden in crypts, destroyed by inquisitors, or simply left aside, classified as heresy without even being read carefully. But now, with the rediscovery of this manuscript, with the courage of independent researchers and the advancement of technology, these truths are resurfacing, and with them, the urgent need to rethink faith, history, and the spiritual legacy that has been erased from the collective memory. And perhaps you, who have been watching this far, already feel this, that something doesn't fit, that there is a fuller, truer, more human version of Jesus' life that has been systematically erased, that the Vatican knows more than it reveals, that the truth is coming to light, not because someone authorized it, but because it is impossible to contain it forever. Imagine if the public knew that there was a direct lineage of Jesus outside the control of the Vatican. Imagine what this would mean for traditional faith, for the institutional power of the Church, and for everything that, for centuries, was presented as absolute truth, a living lineage, blood descendants of the Messiah himself, walking the earth throughout history, far from altars, pulpits, and dogmas, people who may not even know who they really are, or worse, who do, but have been forced to live in secret, for
fear of repression, persecution, judgment. This wouldn't just be new info, it would be a spiritual and historical bomb, capable of shaking the foundations of Western religiosity as we know it. And it is precisely this idea that this forbidden manuscript supports with an almost He not only claims that Jesus had children, but also insinuates that these children were protected by a network of loyal followers, people who knew that Christ's mission did not end on the
cross, and that his legacy should be preserved not only in texts, but in flesh and blood. The text, in one of the most impactful passages, goes so far as to say that the seed of the saint was planted in a foreign land and watered with silence and light. A powerful metaphor that, when decoded, reveals an unsettling truth. Jesus not only left disciples, but also heirs, spiritual and physical heirs, whose existence represents the continuity of Christ, not only as a symbol, but as a living presence. Over the centuries, this possibility was fought with all the weapons of orthodoxy. Councils were organized, texts were excluded, heresies were defined not by a lack of faith, but by an excess of truth, because the truth, when it hurts power, becomes dangerous. And what could be more dangerous for a centralized religious structure than admitting that its founder's lineage is alive, active, and, most importantly, beyond its control? This is why, to this day, the Vatican has never officially commented on these texts. No notes, no deep theological studies, no solid refutations, just silence. A silence that screams, a silence that protects something much bigger than we imagine. This manuscript, found in a forgotten Middle Eastern library and now translated by independent scholars, also describes how Mary Magdalene and her children were taken to distant regions where they could grow up far from persecution. The south of Gaul, present-day France, is the most cited place, and, interestingly, it is there that we find popular traditions, legends, and even ancient artistic representations that show Mary Magdalene with a child in her arms. Many say it is just symbolic, a representation of faith. But what if it isn't? What if this image is an echo of a muffled truth, one that has survived discreetly through art and oral tradition? In the Middle Ages, some secret orders, such as the Knights Templar, would have discovered records that confirmed this lineage. And instead of destroying them, as the Church wanted, they decided to protect them. This secret mission, according to some alternative historians, would have been one of the real reasons why the Vatican decided to exterminate the Templars on Friday the 13th in 1307. They knew too much. They knew something that could change everything. It wasn't just about money or military power. It was about knowledge. It was about the lineage of Christ. And keeping this lineage hidden would from then on become a permanent mission of the Roman clergy. From that point on, all mentions of a possible descent from Jesus were labeled heresy. Mary Magdalene, who in some texts appears as a wife, was transformed into a prostitute. The idea of a family was suppressed. The image of Christ was carefully shaped as that of a celibate, pure being without any worldly connections. And all questions about his humanity were swept beneath centuries of liturgy, icons and masses. Jesus' body became a symbol of sacrifice. But what if, in fact, he had chosen to live, chosen to protect your family, your wife, and your children? What if the real sacrifice was silence? Imagine how many people over the centuries might have felt closer to Jesus, more connected to him, if they had known that he was also a father, that he also loved, that he was also afraid for those he loved. Imagine how many women could have felt more spiritually included if they had known that Mary Magdalene was not excluded, but magnified alongside the Messiah. Imagine the impact this would have on how we view women's role in faith, the value of sacred motherhood, and the right to question narratives imposed by a clerical elite. And perhaps that is why this manuscript, with all its explosive content, continues to be ignored by the great religious authorities. Because he not only speaks of a different Jesus, but of a different church. One that could have been but wasn't. A more human faith, more connected to life, more true. A faith where there is no separation between the sacred and love, between the divine and the blood, between the spirit and the womb. Jesus' lineage, if confirmed, is the thread that pulls the whole ball of official history and exposes the plot that was woven to protect power, not the truth. If you've come this far, it's because you're ready to go further, to look with different eyes, to think freely, and to feel deeply. So write here in the comments, if this lineage exists, the world needs to know. This shows that you are with us on this journey for knowledge and light. If you feel it in your heart, let yours also prayer request, because even in the face of these great truths, spirituality continues to be the center of everything. And it is no coincidence that the traces of this possible lineage of Jesus, as well as the documents that support it, have reappeared precisely in places historically linked to secret orders such as the Knights Templar, and in Gnostic manuscripts carefully hidden for centuries. The evidence does not appear in isolation, like legends lost in time. They are connected to specific points on the map, to regions marked by spiritual conflicts, religious persecution, and above all, desperate attempts to protect truths that should never come to light. One of the most enigmatic places when talking about the preservation of ancient manuscripts linked to Jesus and Mary Magdalene is the city of Rennes-le-Château in the south of France. This small village is, to this day, surrounded by mysteries. During the 19th century, Father Béranger Saunière would have found secret documents when reforming the local church. Documents that spoke precisely of Jesus' sacred lineage, directly linking Mary Magdalene to the region. Not by chance, local traditions state that Magdalene lived there as a refugee after fleeing persecution in Jerusalem. Medieval chronicles, symbolic sculptures, and even hidden crypts indicate that the secret was there, dormant, and that the Templars, for a time, served as guardians of this knowledge. Knights Templar, as we know, were not just a military force. They were an initiatory spiritual order, with access to forbidden knowledge, much of which was acquired during the Crusades in the Holy Land. And it is precisely in his wanderings through places like Jerusalem, Acre, Qumran, and Cairo that they would have had contact with ancient texts that never officially reached the West. Reports suggest that among the secrets they protected were fragments of Gnostic gospel, coded letters in apostle, and detailed accounts of Jesus' hidden life after his supposed crucifixion. These documents, according to some alternative historians, were taken to Templar fortresses such as Montségur, Gisors Castle and Take, in places that to this day carry occult symbols carved into stone, representations of Mary Magdalene the child, and reference to a secret lineage. Furthermore, we cannot ignore the role of Gnostic manuscripts from Nag Hammadi, discovered in 1945 in Egypt. In this impressive collection of forgotten texts, were Gospels that were never accepted by the Church, precisely because they presented a radically different vision of Jesus. In them, he is portrayed as a master of knowledge, who reveals spiritual secrets not to everyone, but to those who were ready, among them Mary Magdalene, described as the one who understood what the other disciples were unable to achieve. These texts speak of spiritual union, hidden teachings, and a mission that goes beyond the cross. And when read together with the manuscript found in the forgotten Middle Eastern library, they begin to form a coherent mosaic, revealing a more human, deeper, and perhaps truer Jesus. One of the most impactful Gospels found in Nag Hammadi is the so-called Gospel of Mary, where Magdalene appears as a spiritual leader after Jesus' departure. The male disciples do not understand his words, and Peter, in particular, questions his authority. But she insists, saying that she received instructions directly from the Master that were not given to anyone else. The text ends abruptly, as if it had been interrupted or censored, and this raises even more suspicions about the true extent of this message. Why was this gospel never included in the Bible? Why was Mary Magdalene silenced? Another crucial point in this web of mysteries are the hidden libraries, like the legendary Vatican secret library. It is estimated that this site contains more than 85 kilometers of shelves, with thousands of manuscripts not yet digitized, many of which are kept under strict secrecy. Entry is restricted, and only scholars with papal authorization have access. Documents such as letters from the first church fathers, Gnostic treatises, Hebrew codices, and texts considered dangerous for challenging the official version of the faith are locked there, away from public reach. And according to complaints made by former members of the Curia, there is at least 7 complete Gospels kept there that were never made public. Among them, one that describes in detail the life of Jesus with his family after his escape from Jerusalem. Outside the Vatican, other holy places are also mentioned as points of protection for secret documents. The St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai is one of these living relics. Isolated in the middle of the desert, this monastery has one of the oldest collections of Christian manuscripts, many of which have not yet been translated. There are reports that, among its archives, there are alternative versions of the crucifixion, and even records of early Christian communities that revered Mary Magdalene as the bearer of the lineage of light. Also in Ethiopia, there are churches carved out of stone, like those of Lalibela, where manuscripts in Ge'ez, the local liturgical language, hold rare and unknown passages from the life of Jesus. In some of these passages, there are references to a female figure with great spiritual importance, directly linked to the Messiah. Coincidence? Maybe not. The custodians of these texts rarely allow their translation, and the Ethiopian Church has a peculiar relationship with Christianity. It preserves traditions much closer to Semitic and Jewish roots than Roman Catholicism. When all these pieces are put together, the Gnostic manuscripts of Nag Hammadi, the Templar archives, the records of Rennes-le-Château, the hidden libraries of the Middle East, and Africa, a new portrait of Jesus begins to emerge. A portrait that does not necessarily contradict her divinity, but that expands her, humanizes her, and connects her to a deeper truth. Jesus may have left more than words. He may have left descendants, a hidden, sacred lineage, hidden behind the scenes of history. And if this lineage is alive, then the faith needs to be revised. Spirituality needs to be reconnected with truth, not dogma. She appears as an equal, as a mother, as the guardian of a secret that has passed through generations. Mary Magdalene, portrayed in apocryphal texts, and especially in this hidden manuscript, is not the repentant sinner that traditional dogma has long portrayed. She is described as a spiritual companion, initiated into the mysteries of the kingdom, consort of the Master and mother of his children, a woman who not only deeply understood the teachings of Jesus, but who played an essential role in continuing what he started, not as a symbol, but as life, not as a liturgical memory, but as the seed of a living legacy which has been hidden, fragmented, buried under layers of liturgy, power, and theological convenience. The manuscript found, which we mentioned earlier, describes the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene with a sensitivity that shocks, precisely because it is so human and at the same time so divine. They walked together, shared bread, discussed teachings, prayed in silence. He trusted her with words that he did not dare say to the other disciples. She understood him before he even spoke. In one of the most striking passages of the text, it is said that, among men, she was the only one who saw the light of the Master before his mouth spoke the word. And it is in this same text that the reference to a child appears, discreetly but unequivocally, and the womb of Mary shone, for in her womb the continuation of the promise germinated. This phrase, which at first glance may seem poetic or symbolic, is the key to an understanding that transforms everything, because it suggests, with all the delicacy of an ancient language, that Mary Magdalene bore Jesus' son. And it's not just any child, it is the link that connects the life of Christ to the future of humanity, not by mythology, but by blood, by descent, for real continuity, physical and spiritual. And this link, according to the manuscript, was protected by her with the same strength with which a mother would protect her child's life, but with the wisdom of someone who knew she was carrying something much bigger than herself. This is why Mary appears in these texts as more than a disciple. She is seen as keeper of the hidden light, as the one who not only received the teaching, but who gave birth to the next stage of it. And this vision radically changes the female role within the structure of faith. Because if the first bearer of Jesus' lineage was a woman, and if the guardian of the Messiah's secret was his companion, then the entire patriarchal structure built around traditional Christianity needs to be revised. And perhaps this is one of the deepest reasons why the figure of Mary Magdalene was debased, silenced, distorted, not just out of fear of the truth, but out of fear of the woman who carried that truth in her womb. Throughout history, there have been several attempts to eliminate or minimize the presence of Magdalena as a central figure. At the Lateran Council in the 12th century, the doctrine of Jesus' chastity was reinforced as a way of nullifying any possibility of involvement with a woman. In the following centuries, Christian iconography reinforced his image kneeling, crying, cleaning Jesus' feet with his hair, always in an inferior position, always marked by repentance. And although the official Gospels mention her constant presence, including as the first witness to the resurrection, little or nothing has been done to recognize the essential role she played not only as a follower, but as a point of transition between the Christ who was and the Christ who would come, through hidden lineage. Interestingly, numerous works of art over the centuries have captured this enigma in subtle detail. Renaissance paintings showing Mary Magdalene with her hand on her belly, Byzantine icons in which she appears next to Jesus, not behind him, but to the side, on the same visual plane, medieval codices in which there is the presence of a child between the two, sometimes camouflaged, sometimes highlighted, but almost always ignored by the official interpretation. These visual clues are like echoes of what was hidden, but never completely disappeared. Because truth has this characteristic. It finds ways to survive, even when the world conspires to erase it. And not only art has preserved this mystery. Oral traditions in some regions of Europe, especially in the south of France, in villages hidden in the mountains of Provence, tell stories of a woman who arrived from the Middle East with a child in her arms, fleeing persecution and protected by few. This woman, according to the ancients, was called the Lady of Light or the Mother of Silence. In some more recent records, her name appears linked to that of Mary, but not to Jesus' mother, but to his companion. These stories passed from generation to generation, almost like tales, but with the care of those who knew they were saying something too precious to be treated as myth. Now, when we look at all these pieces, the apocryphal Gospels, the Gnostic manuscripts, the records of secret orders, the symbols hidden in works of art, and the oral tradition preserved through time, we begin to see that Mary Magdalene was much more than we were told. She was the key, the bridge between the divine and the human, between the promise and the seed, between the word and the flesh. And if all this is true, if there really was a union between her and Jesus, and if children were born from that union, then we need to rewrite the entire theology of redemption, because it doesn't end at the cross. It continues, alive, silent, guarded, waiting to be revealed. If this content touched something inside you, If it made sense, or if it brought you new questions, comment below. Maria was more than they said, or the guardian of the sacred lineage lived. And if you feel it in your heart, leave your prayer request. Together, let us continue this spiritual journey for truth, light, and revelation. The idea of a sacred lineage that was hunted down and erased from history is perhaps one of the most impactful pieces of this entire puzzle. Because when we talk about lineage, we are not just touching on the biological possibility that Jesus left children. We are talking about something much bigger, deeper, and therefore more threatening to the power structures that have been consolidated over the centuries. A direct blood lineage that carries not only genetic inheritance, but also the essence of a spiritual legacy, a living continuity of the message of Christ, not only preached, but lived and protected in secret. In the records found in the lost manuscript, the same one hidden for centuries and rediscovered in a forgotten library in the Middle East, this lineage is described with impressive care. The text does not use direct names for descendants, as if seeking to preserve them from persecution. Instead, he resorts to metaphors such as the root of the eternal olive tree, the children of silence, or the seed of light sealed by Magdalene. These are expressions that evoke mystery, protection, and above all, continuity. This in itself is a direct provocation to the traditional narrative, which concludes Jesus' life on the cross as a complete, definitive, and isolated sacrifice. But if there is a lineage, then the story continues. And this is the point that most frightens defenders of orthodoxy. The idea that this sacred bloodline has been hunted down over the centuries is not just theory. It is supported by historical documents, real persecutions, and intentional silencing. Just look at what happened to the Cathars, for example, in southern France during the 13th century. This mystical community, highly spiritualized, and with doctrines that revered the sacred feminine and a figure of Jesus different from that imposed by Rome, was annihilated by the Inquisition in one of the cruelest crusades in history, the Albigensian Crusade. Coincidence? Or did the Cathars know something? Many scholars believe they kept lineage records, protected in crypts hidden in the Pyrenees Mountains, passed down orally through initiates. When the church found out, it acted brutally, and just like the Cathars, other orders, such as the Templars, were also hunted down and destroyed. You Templars, as we have already mentioned, may have been the guardians of some of these secrets. The order, officially created to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, quickly gained power, land, and influence. But what few know is that the Templars had a line of esoteric studies and a secret library where they stored documents considered heretical by the Church. Among them, texts about Jesus' lineage. When the Vatican realized that it could not control this knowledge, it began to orchestrate the destruction of the order. Friday the 13th in 1307, when hundreds of knights were arrested and tortured, was not just a political move, it was also a desperate attempt to eliminate a threat to the official narrative. Other spiritual lineages that could carry fragments of this legacy were also persecuted. Noble families who protected relics and manuscripts were exterminated or absorbed into papal power. Entire monasteries were wiped off the map. Manuscripts were burned in public bonfires. But even so, fragments resisted. Some came to us encoded, hidden within artistic works, symbolized in stained glass windows in cathedrals, in medieval tapestries, and in discreet sculptures that, to the trained eye, tell a story very different from that taught in official books. In some of these representations, we clearly see Mary Magdalene next to a childlike figure with a sacred aura, not as the Virgin and Child, but rather as an adult woman holding a child with features similar to those of Jesus. This type of image was not well accepted by the dominant doctrine, but it was still recorded by artists who, perhaps guided by secret traditions, wanted to immortalize what they knew. The idea of a sacred lineage also survived through Rosicrucian manuscripts, alchemical records, and esoteric works that circulated among scholars, mystics, and initiates. In them, we find mentions of a spiritual dynasty, a sequence of individuals chosen to carry forward the light of Christ consciousness. These works describe secret encounters, symbolic transfers of wisdom, and even genealogical codes disguised as astrological formulas and sacred numbers. All of this, once again, outside the reach of official doctrine, and, once again, outside the control of the Vatican. And it is this control that over the centuries has proven so relentless, because the recognition of a lineage would break the spiritual monopoly of the Church. If Jesus had children, then his divine inheritance may not be restricted to symbols and sacraments. It may be pulsing, breathing, living somewhere, far from the cathedrals, but much closer to humanity than we imagine. And if this lineage was hunted, if it was erased, silenced, and persecuted, it is because it represented the real threat, the decentralization of the sacred, the idea that faith cannot be controlled, that divinity is not only in the altars, but also in the blood, in the womb, in the spiritual inheritance passed from generation to generation. This is the kind of truth that is not taught in seminars. It is not read in missals. It is a truth that needs to be sought, felt, spiritually connected. And you, who have been watching this far, have already taken the first step. Because questioning is not denying. To question is to seek, and seeking is what connects us to the true light, the one that doesn't need permission to shine. Why has the Church, which claims to seek the truth, never spoken about this text? Why, in the face of a document that brings such profound, transformative, and spiritually powerful revelations, has silence always been the only response? This is one of the most disturbing, and at the same time, most revealing questions of this entire investigation. Because when an institution that positions itself as the guardian of faith and truth refuses to even comment on the existence of a manuscript like this, we have a clear sign that there is something they do not want revealed. And perhaps the reason is not because of a lack of evidence, but precisely because the evidence is too strong. The manuscript we have analyzed so far, with its detailed passages about the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, about the children of this sacred union, about the flight to distant lands, and about the protection of a living lineage. This manuscript has never been directly refuted by the Church. There is no official document that disputes it, no doctrinal analysis that combats it, not even a public note that says, "This is false." And why is this important? Because silence, in this case, speaks louder than any denial. It reveals the discomfort. He denounces the strategy. The Church, since its first centuries, built its doctrine based on choices. Gospels were accepted, others were rejected. Councils were organized to decide what the people should believe and what should be buried, literally, under the rubble of history. And the texts that threatened the official image of a celibate Jesus, of a Christ without human ties, were the first to disappear, not because of a lack of spirituality, but because of an excess of humanity. And this has always been seen as dangerous, because a Jesus who loves, who marries, who has children, who protects his family, is a Jesus who connects too much with ordinary people. And when faith becomes close, it stops being a tool of control. The institution preferred to maintain the narrative of the cross, of sacrifice, of redemptive suffering. But he silenced everything that could suggest continuity. And that's where silence becomes revealing. Because a church that claims to seek truth, but ignores a manuscript with the potential to transform the way we view the life of Jesus, is not seeking light. You are protecting a structure. It is preserving a theology built on historical, political, and spiritual convenience. And the proof of this is that the few scholars who tried to open this debate within the church itself were censored, removed, and silenced. How many theologians have been threatened or excommunicated for even mentioning the possibility that Jesus had a married life? How many books were banned, not because they denied the faith, but because they expanded it beyond the limits imposed? How many times has the figure of Mary Magdalene been demeaned, distorted, vilified, simply because she represented a threat to the male monopoly of the sacred? The answer lies in the records of ecclesiastical history itself, in conciliar decisions, in the papal orders that ordered the burning of gospels, in the edicts that prohibited the reading of certain texts, in tight control over what can or cannot be interpreted as divine inspiration. But this control has cracks. With the discovery of new manuscripts, with the advancement of archaeology and translation technology, with the awakening of a new spiritual generation, these truths begin to slip through the fingers of the system. Today, with access to information like never before, people are asking questions, and it is exactly this question that the church fears, because she knows that once that question rings out, "Why didn't you guys ever talk about this?" the structure begins to shake, and most importantly, trust breaks down. After all, if the institution that should be the first to protect the truth chose to ignore it, then what else could have been hidden? What other documents are locked away deep in the Vatican's secret library? How many manuscripts have never been shown to the world? Why are there so many restrictions on independent scholars' access to these archives? Why do only a few have the right to know, while millions follow an incomplete story? These questions are not accusations. They are calls for transparency, for spiritual honesty, for a faith that is not afraid of the light. And it is exactly this fear that betrays the truth. Because if there was no basis, the Vatican would have denied it. He would have given conferences, publications, theological debates. But he chose silence. And silence, as we know, is one of the most effective forms of censorship. But it's also one of the clearest signs that there's something precious being hidden. And that's why we're here, in this video, in this conversation, in this rescue. Because the truth does not need approval. It just needs to be said. And now that it begins to emerge, there is no more burying it. If you also ask yourself this question, why has the Church never spoken about this text? Write here in the comments, "The Vatican's silence says it all," or, "If it was a lie, they would have denied it." These phrases help spread this reflection and show that you are part of this journey through revelation. And of course, if you want to leave your prayer request, write with faith, because even in the face of so many hidden truths, we continue together spiritually. If this is true, everything changes. The cross, the cult, the dogmas, the way we were taught to understand the sacrifice of Jesus, the liturgy of the churches, the theology built on suffering and redemption, this entire structure is transformed in the face of the real possibility that Jesus lived after the crucifixion, united with Mary Magdalene, and generated a lineage that survived in secret throughout the centuries. This truth changes the center of the Christian faith, because if Jesus' life continued in silence, in remote places, hidden for safety, next to his family, then the cross ceases to be the end and becomes just a chapter, not the climax, of his spiritual and human journey. And this is where reflection becomes inevitable, because if there is continuity, there is legacy, and if there is a legacy, there is responsibility. What do we do with this knowledge? How do we deal with the revelation that perhaps the image of the crucified Christ was used to maintain a narrative of pain, sacrifice, and guilt, when its true mission was love, light, and life in fullness? This does not negate its importance, but it expands what it represents. A master who not only died for us, but who also lived for us, who loved, who protected, who fathered children, who fought to keep his lineage out of the clutches of those who wanted to transform his message into institutional power. If the cross was not the end, then the cult centered on suffering loses its exclusivity. Blood is no longer the only way to salvation, and the dogmas, built to control masses, begin to crumble, giving way to a more conscious, closer, more real spirituality. This truth brings Jesus close. It shows that he was not just the Son of God who came down from heaven with a heavenly mission. He was also a man who felt, who cried, who feared, who protected, who made difficult decisions, who loved deeply, and who perhaps, most of all, trusted that his message would be carried forward not just by books, but by people who came from his blood, from his flesh, from the union with the one who was silenced for so long, Mary Magdalene. Imagine for a moment what that means. That faith no longer needs to be conditioned to the altar, to confession, to the intermediary, that the divine may have lived not only among us, but like one of us. That salvation is not distant, projected in suffering, but present, alive, pulsating within history, within a lineage, within a continuity. That Jesus did not come to found an institutional religion, but to plant a seed. And this seed was watered by silence, cultivated in the shadows, protected by initiates, and now it is, little by little, coming to light. This is why the impact of this revelation is not just theological. He is emotional, existential, spiritual. Because what you believed to be untouchable, immutable, absolute, now turns out to be partial, edited, controlled. This is not a threat to faith. On the contrary, it is an invitation to true faith, the one who is not afraid of questions, the one who does not bow down to imposed dogmas, the one who seeks, investigates, surrenders to the light even when it exposes the cracks in the temple. A faith that is reborn not with fear, but with courage. If all this is true, then we need to look again at history. Rewrite the Gospels not with ink, but with conscience. Review the symbols of the cross, the altar, the chalice. Rethink the role of the church, the place of women, the value of lineage. Because what has always been most vehemently denied by religious authority were not baseless heresies. They were truths with the potential for liberation. There were narratives like this, which speak of a life after the cross, of forbidden love, of hidden children, of descendants who can still walk among us today. This idea is strong, it bothers, it messes with everything, but it also heals, because we finally begin to understand that faith is not something you receive ready-made. It's something that is built, and that spiritual truth is not in the fear of making mistakes, but in the courage to question. When Jesus spoke of, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free," he was not referring to a text approved by a council, nor to an institutionalized dogma. He spoke of the truth that frees you from the inside out, the one that touches the soul, which reveals, what transforms. And that's exactly what we're doing here, touching what has been hidden, unearthing what was buried, and allowing us to feel the impact of what may be the greatest revelation in the modern history of Christianity. Because if there really is a living lineage of Jesus, then it carries within itself not only the memory of what was, but the promise of what can still be. A new way of living spirituality. A new way of looking at the sky, with our feet planted on earth and our hearts open to the light. If this reflection spoke to you, if it somehow opened your eyes to something you had never considered, write in the comments, "If this is true, everything changes." This phrase helps spread this awakening and shows that you are walking with us on this journey of revelation, awareness, and liberation. If you want, you can also leave your prayer request, because despite all these hidden truths, spirituality remains the center of our search. And if all of this has already affected your faith, your understanding of history, and even your perception of what is truth or manipulation, then take a deep breath, because what comes next could shake even more of the structures that have been taught for centuries. Because if the idea of a direct lineage from Jesus is, in itself, revolutionary, now imagine a hidden gospel that claims he is still among us, not in spirit alone, not symbolically, through faith, but present in flesh and blood, through your living lineage, protected and hidden in silence for generations. This next document that we will discuss, and which, apparently, was discovered in the same regions of the Middle East where other Gnostic texts were recovered, contains statements so bold and mystical that even the most skeptical scholars were forced to question the official story. He talks about a promise made by Jesus himself to Mary Magdalene and one of her children. A promise of continuity, protection, spiritual preservation, not through the religious institution, but through the blood, the flesh, the lineage that carries within it the spark of the sacred. This mysterious gospel, which was hidden for centuries in parchments, wrapped in goatskins, and kept in caves sealed by Aramaic symbols, not only reinforces the idea that Jesus had descendants. He suggests that part of this lineage was taken to strategic locations, where secret traditions took care of their protection, and more. There is talk of the existence of a living guardian of the Christic light, someone who carries not only the genetic inheritance, but also the original spiritual mission, and which would remain hidden until the right time. This revelation takes us to an even deeper dimension of everything we are investigating, because it's no longer just about revisiting the past. Now, we are talking about implications for the present, and perhaps the future of spiritual humanity. The Possibility that Jesus' lineage not only existed, but still exists, completely changes the way we see faith, religious authority, the mission of life that has been covered up by layers and layers of doctrines. And this brings us to a delicate point. If this lineage is still alive, where is it? Who are the guardians? Why haven't they revealed themselves yet? And who is stopping this from coming to light? These are questions that echo like spiritual drums amid the secular silence imposed by the Vatican and other religious authorities. These are questions that the Church itself never dared to raise, perhaps for fear of what it would find, or because deep down they always knew. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because you're different. You feel that there is something much bigger behind the official story, and you had the courage to go deeper, to listen, to question, and that's why I thank you. I really do. But now I need to invite you to take the next step on this journey. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because the next videos will delve even deeper into the hidden Gospels, the revelations that the Vatican never wanted you to know, and the possible existence of the living lineage of Jesus. And if you made it this far, comment below. I went all the way because I want the truth. This shows that you are with us on this quest, and it also helps this video reach more awakened people like you. Leave yours too, because this greatly strengthens the channel and shows YouTube that this content needs to be delivered to more people who are ready to hear what has been hidden for centuries. And now, you can't leave without clicking on next video that is appearing here on the screen. In it, you will discover the lost gospel that claims Jesus did not die on the cross. An even deeper revelation, even more controversial, and one that you need to see with your own eyes. I'll wait for you.